Congratulations on getting a hold of the look hacking system for DaVinci Resolve. You're going to learn how to recreate any look of any film. If you're like myself and many other filmmakers out there, you may spend a lot of time watching movies and being amazed by their looks. You sometimes, like me, might wonder how a filmmaker achieves a particular look and may even want to try out a similar look on your own project. Well, this is what this training is all about. We're going to go through the process of breaking down 2 Hollywood films and then apply those looks to clips of our own. This may seem like a daunting task, but we're going to follow a process that will make this a lot easier. We're going to ask ourselves a number of questions about the look with the goal of translating that look into language. Then from there, we can then turn that language into actionable corrections with the help of our video scopes so we can apply the same look to our image. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure that your footage has a similar art direction to the reference image or the look that you're going for. Though you can make some pretty significant changes to the look in Resolve, there are some limitations to how much we can change a scene. Okay, so here are the things we need to ask ourselves when evaluating a look. First, we'll ask some very general questions that revolve around the hue, saturation, and luma of the reference still. We'll follow a workflow that incorporates all of those, but in a different order. Like with the typical color grading workflow that we use during color correction, we'll first look at the luma, then hue, then saturation. So following that order, let's first take a look at the luma-related questions we should ask ourselves. What is the brightness and contrast like in the image? Is it a bright scene or a dark scene? Would you consider the contrast to be high key or low key? You'll want to get a good screen grab from the film you're trying to emulate so that we can bring that into Resolve and analyze it using the video scopes. Once we do that, we can ask more specific questions like, where's the trace gathered in the waveform? Is there detail in the shadows? And if so, how much? Is there detail in the brightest highlights? And if so, how much? Then we can move on to analyzing the color in the image. What colors do you see? Does the image have a single dominant color? Does the scene follow a particular color scheme? What color are the highlights? What color are the shadows and undertones? And as the final step in the workflow, let's ask the questions, what are the saturation levels like? Is there a certain object or color that's emphasized or more saturated than the others? Armed with this information, we can then recreate any look that we like, again, assuming that the art direction and the type of shot is similar to the source material that we're trying to emulate. In this tutorial, we're going to recreate looks for Mad Max, Fury Road, and the film Her. The first thing we'll need is a good high-resolution reference still. If you have a Blu-ray available, that will give you the best quality, but in most cases, pulling from streaming sites will give you a good result as well. However, because of recently implemented copy protections, you may end up with a black frame for a screenshot if you're trying to pull still from a streaming site like Netflix. The success with this varies depending upon your browser and location. Also, one thing you want to be aware of when pulling stills from the internet, stills you find on Google are often heavily compressed and oversaturated. This can happen because the actual grading in the film is actually different from the grading done for the movie trailer. Now, to get those screen grabs, if you're on a Mac, you can grab a still by hitting Command-Shift-3 as the video plays back. The still will then appear on your desktop. If you're on Windows, you can grab a still by hitting the Print Screen button. The still will then be saved in the Screenshots folder, which is located inside of the Pictures folder. In our case, I've already gone ahead and grabbed all the stills we need. For our first example, we're going to use 2 different reference stills from Mad Max Fury Road. One of them is a close-up shot of Max's face, and the other is a wide shot that shows the sky. Let's start by asking ourselves the questions I mentioned earlier so that we can put this look into language. Speaking generally, with regard to brightness and contrast, these are bright, daytime images with high contrast. Using the video scopes to assist us, you can see that the waveform confirms the high contrast based on the expanded trace on both images. Now we should look for highlight and shadow detail. Except for the brightest highlights on the car, the highlights maintain detail. If you look at the highlights on Max's forehead, you can see this more clearly. The shadows, while not crushed on the waveform, are pretty deep and don't maintain much detail. So now that we've evaluated the reference stills for contrast, let's match it the best we can using the video scopes as a guide. We'll use the image of Max as our reference for now. With the first image selected, let's shift-click Shot 2 and turn on the split screen view. Then we'll switch the view from Versions to Selected Clips. Let's also zoom in a bit so we can see our work more clearly. Okay, now we can see both images side by side, and we can see their corresponding traces in the scopes side by side. This image was shot with a log gamma profile, so we'll have quite a bit of flexibility as we make changes. However, it can be difficult to evaluate contrast with such low saturation, so let's increase the saturation to 100. Now using the curves, let's drag the bottom point to the right until the shadows line up with the reference still. Then drag the top point to the left to match the highlights. And from here, we'll create an S-curve to increase the exposure of the overtones and darken the undertones. I'll make a point here and drag up and to the left, and then make another point here and drag down and to the right slightly. The contrast now matches pretty closely. We can always make adjustments later if we need to. Also, you may notice that the clouds in the background are looking pretty blown out, but we'll fix this later. Before moving on to color, let's make sure that the highlights in the image are neutral. This will make our upcoming corrections to color much easier. This image doesn't need much of an adjustment, but it'll still be a worthwhile step to perform. Let's first drag the offset control down so we can clearly see the clouds that we'll be using as a white reference. Now let's switch the waveform over to the color overlay mode. And now using the gain control, let's shift the highlights slightly towards blue until part of the trace representing the clouds turns white. Okay, great. Now let's just reset the offset. We're going to have a lot of nodes by the end, so let's make sure to name our nodes as we go. Let's right-click on the node to add a label. We're going to call this one Base Correction. Okay, now let's move on to color. The first question we should ask is, what colors do we see? In both reference stills, we can see a heavy amount of orange as well as cyan in the sky. The clouds and smoke also appear slightly pink. If you look at the vector scope, we can see that this film follows a complementary color scheme, which means almost all the colors in the scheme sit directly across from each other on the color wheel. The shadows and undertones have a very slight teal quality to them, while the highlights are neutral in color. Looking at the combined trace on the vector scope for the two images, you can also see that there are high levels of saturation with the trace extending far out from the center. So let's apply this color scheme to our image. We'll use one of my favorite tricks for making applying a color scheme really easy. Let's add another node and name it Grayscale. Now let's bring the saturation down to 0. Then we'll add another node and name it Color. Let's switch to the vector scope, and using the gain control, if we drag on the color wheel, we can see our image change in the vector scope. Because we're adding this color over a grayscale image, the trace will appear as a straight line. Our goal here is to match the hue angle of the reference image as well as get the trace to extend out from the center in equal amount. So let's drag towards orange to accomplish this. Okay, now let's turn off the grayscale node. And when we turn off the node, you can see that our color correction is way too strong. So let's go to the key panel and dial back the output gain control until the trace of our image in the vector scope is closer to the reference image. Now we need to make some further adjustments to color, so we'll go to the curves panel and select the hue versus hue curve. The goal here is to get the trace of the vector scope to more closely mimic the trace of the reference still. Our image extends a little too far towards red and yellow, so I'll first click the yellow vector and drag up slightly. And then click the red vector and drag down. Okay, now we'll make some color adjustments using custom curves. We'll go back to the custom curves, and what I'd like to do is to start by creating an S curve. Let's click on the red channel, and we'll make a point here and drag up. This will add red to the 3/4 tones to more accurately reproduce the skin tones. Then we'll make a point here to add cyan to the quarter tones, helping to create warm, cool contrast. Let's also drag the bottom point to the right to create a much better match in the shadows. I want to reduce the yellow just a bit, so I'll click on the blue channel, click on the top point, and drag it to the left. Okay, we're making some progress, so let's keep going using Resolve secondary tools to really make this image look great. Let's add a parallel node so that we can avoid the color adjustment we just made. This will make sampling the sky easier. Let's name this node Sky. Then we'll turn off the split screen and fit the image to the viewer with Shift-Z. Now let's go to the qualifier panel and then drag through the sky with the eyedropper like so. We'll turn on the highlight feature, then refine the key, adding some blur, and making a few small adjustments in the matte finesse panel. Okay, now let's turn off the highlight feature, click on shot 1, then Command or Control click on shot 3. Then we'll turn on the split screen and zoom in. Now using the gain control, let's drag it towards cyan until the hue of the sky matches with the reference still. Now we need to match the luma, so I'll switch back to the luma waveform and drag the gain control down until the sky traces line up in both shots like this. Then to make it look a little more natural, I'm going to use a rectangle window to have the sky colors fall off a bit. Again, we'll have to turn off the split screen and fit the image to the window with Shift-Z. Let's go to the Windows panel and click on the rectangular shape. Then position it like so that it's about halfway between the top of the frame and the ground. And make sure to add some softening. Now let's go to the tracker panel, turn off Perspective 3D, and track the shape forward. Let's go back to the first frame, bring back our split screen view, and zoom in. Let's also bring the vector scope back as well. Okay, now we just need to adjust the saturation control, so again, while watching the vector scope, we'll increase the saturation until the traces match. While staying in the parallel track, let's add another node, call it Clouds, and work on the cloud hue and brightness. Turn off the split screen, turn on the highlight feature, and fit the image to the window. Now we'll drag up on the low until we just see the brightest parts of the image. Then add some low soft, and increase the low a little bit more. Now we'll need to limit this further, so let's go into the Windows panel, click on a power curve, and draw a curve around the clouds so we're further qualifying this HSL key with a shape. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to separate the clouds from the rest of the image so we're not picking up any of the other highlights. And now let's go to the tracker panel and track it forward. Okay, perfect. So let's go back to the first frame, turn on the split screen, and zoom in. We'll switch back to the waveform, and then we'll bring the exposure of the clouds down with the gain control. We'll also need to push the clouds towards the color of the dust and smoke in the reference shot. So this obviously is a bit too far, so I'll fix this by increasing the exposure of the shadows. Add a little bit of cyan to the shadows, and some to the midtones. Lastly, I'd also like to neutralize the brightest highlights. To do this, let's append a node to the end of the chain and name it Highlights. Like we did before, we'll turn off the split screen, fit the image to the window, turn on the highlight feature, and go to the qualifier panel. Then let's drag through the brightest parts of the talent's hand. It grabbed a little more than what I want, so I'll drag the low up, add some blur, and turn off the highlight feature. The easiest way to achieve this is to simply pull out the saturation. So let's reduce the saturation to about 25. Okay, let's do one more side-by-side comparison with a shot of Max. I'll click to show my clips, turn on the split screen, click on shot 1, and Command or Control click on shot 2. And again, we'll hide the clips and zoom in. Okay, this is looking pretty good, but our shot is looking a bit hotter than the reference still. So let's add another node and call it Output Contrast. And now all we need to do is to drag the gain control down until the brightest highlights align in the waveform for both shots. So here's a breakdown of what we did. I'll turn off all the nodes one by one until we get back to the original image and then back on. To compare, I'm going to turn on a split screen with all three shots selected. It's looking pretty convincing. So again, to match this look, we followed the following steps. Number 1, we grabbed a high resolution still from the source material that we wanted to emulate. Number 2, define the look using the color language we talked about. And number 3, we then use the split screen view and the video scopes to help us achieve our match. So let's try this one more time with a completely different look. In this case, we're going to pick a still from the movie Her. And by the way, the example image that we're using to match to Her is from filmsupply.com. The artist is Cypher, and it's from the Cosmic Event Collection. Just like before, we'll first need to put this look into language. In general, this is conveying an overcast afternoon and has moderately low contrast with elevated shadows and muted highlights. Let's take a look at just the skin tones to get help with our matching. You can see that they sit between zones 3 and 6. Okay, so now let's adjust for contrast. We'll attack the color later. Let's highlight both clips by shift-clicking, turn on the split screen view, and zooming in. Let's first get the trace to sit in the middle of the waveform by dragging the offset control to the right. This will give us a better place to start from. Now using custom curves, we'll drag the bottom point for the shadows until the traces in both images align. Now we'll make a point here and drag up. I'm keeping my eye on these parts of both traces, which represent the brightest parts of the man's skin. Now let's make a point here and drag it up and to the left slightly, keeping our eye on these parts of both traces. Now we just need to readjust the bottom point so that the traces match. The sky is obviously brighter than the reference shot, but we can fix that next. Let's name this node Contrast, and then we'll move on. Let's add another node and name it Sky. And move to the qualifier panel. We'll need to turn off the split screen, fit the shot to the window, and turn on the highlight feature. Now with the eyedropper, let's drag through the sky from top to bottom. We'll refine the key by increasing the low soft and dragging the low to the right. Let's also max out the high control. Then we'll add some blur. Let's get our reference still back up. We'll turn off the highlight feature, turn on the split screen, and zoom in. Now let's pull the gain control down until the skies match in both shots. Alright, now that we have the contrast and the sky matching better, let's now take a look at the color. I've increased the scale of the trace in the vector scope to make it easier to see since both images have relatively low saturation. This shot has an analogous color scheme, which means it's only using colors that are directly next to each other on the color wheel. The image is only made up of yellow, orange, and red. So that we don't get distracted by the red-orange shirt, I've gone ahead and desaturated it so we can just see the color for the rest of the image. Now if we move to our shot of the man on the roof, we can see that this shot incorporates more of a complementary color scheme with mostly orange and blue cyan. We'll work with the still with the gray shirt for this part. I'm going to command click shot 3, turn on the split screen, and zoom in. We'll also need the vector scope available, and we should check on the 2x zoom so we can see what we're doing a bit better. Then we'll make a new node and name it Color. Now using the highlight control, we want to drag towards orange until the traces generally align. I'm watching the bottoms of the traces to see that they align and making sure that the trace doesn't extend further to the left or right of the reference still trace. In the vector scope, you can see that the trace of our shot is much more saturated than the reference still, so I'll reduce the saturation. Now like before, let's use secondary tools to perfect the look. On the color node, I'm going to go into the hue versus hue curve, click on the red vector, and drag it down until the trace is closer to the reference shot. Then click on the yellow vector and drag it up slightly. Now we'll move to the hue versus saturation curve, click the red vector, and drag it down until this red spike aligns with the trace. As a finishing touch, I'd like to bring up the exposure on only the talent's face to make a better match. Let's add a parallel node to go back to the image before our color correction. Call it Face, and then go to the qualifier panel. We'll need to turn the split screen off and fit the clip to the window. We'll turn on the highlight feature, Then with the eyedropper, we'll drag through just the man's skin tones, and then make some refinements to improve the key. Give me just a moment while I do this. Now I'd like to just limit the correction to the man's face, so going to the Windows panel, we'll further qualify our key by turning on a circular window and positioning it around his face. Then we can go to the tracker panel and track the shot forward to make sure that the window stays with him. Now let's go back to the first frame, turn on the split screen, and zoom in. Let's switch to the waveform, increase the highlights with the gain control, and the midtones a little bit. And then just make a few changes to the color. We'll increase the saturation and pull the midtones towards yellow. Now all we need to do is to match the sky in both shots. Let's move to the sky node and switch to the color overlay waveform. Then we'll fix the sky color using the custom curves. I'll click on red and drag the top point down until the red sky traces align. Then I'll click on the blue channel and drag the top point to the left until the traces align. It's looking much better. I think that the whole image could use just a small exposure boost, so I'm going to append a node, name it Output Contrast, and then with the highlight control, drag up just slightly. That looks really great. Now I'll go back and turn off each node one by one to review the changes we've made. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this super powerful system for understanding how to break down a look into language that you can then use to recreate the look of any film. I suggest that you practice it out, try creating different looks from different films, and happy hacking.